Recitation from the Holy Quran. Esteemed panelists, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good evening from Pakistan. On behalf of the Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad, and the Arms Control and Disarmament Center at the Institute, I warmly welcome you all to today's panel discussion on US nuclear policy under Biden, prospects and challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know that the US nuclear and arms control policy went under a major shift during the Trump administration. Trump not only withdrew from major arms control and disarmament treaties, but he also proposed to develop low-yield nuclear weapons capabilities and try to erode the norms against the use of nuclear weapons. Trump administration was also interested to resume nuclear testing. However, the new Biden administration is ready to revisit Trump's policies and is willing to re-engage on bilateral and multilateral issues. Biden believes in using diplomacy and restraints in nuclear and arms control matters. He has already extended the New START treaty and offered to restart nuclear talks with Iran, which are welcoming developments. So in order to explore the US nuclear policy under Biden, prospects and challenges, the Arms Control and Disarmament Center at the ISSI has organized this panel discussion. And we are honored to have among us well-known international national experts. Now, I will take this opportunity to introduce our esteemed panelists. Our first panelist is Mr. James Acton. Mr. James holds the Jessica T. Matthews Chair and is co-director of Nuclear Policy Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace at Washington, D.C. Mr. Acton's current research focuses on the escalation risks of advanced conventional weapons and the future of arms control. Ladies and gentlemen, our second panelist is Dr. Peter Topkinov. He is a senior researcher in the Supreme Nuclear Disarmament, Arms Control, Non-Proliferation Program. Peter works on issues related to nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament, arms control, and the impact of new technologies on strategic stability. Our third panelist is Mr. Zhu Chongyang, senior researcher, China's Arms Control and Disarmament Association, CACDA, China. Our fourth panelist is Mr. Usman Iqbal Jadoon. Mr. Jadoon is working as a Director General, United Nations in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs since September 2000. He has previously served as Director for Arms Control and Disarmament at the Ministry. And our last and final panelist is Dr. Adil Sultan. Dr. Sultan is Acting Dean and Head of Department, Faculty of Aerospace and Security Studies, Air University, Islamabad. He has served at Pakistan Strategic Plan Division for over 14 years. Dr. Adil has published a book titled Universalizing Nuclear Non-Proliferation Norms, a Regional Framework for the South Asian Nuclear Weapon State, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Before we start our panel discussion, I would like to ask Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry if he wants to make a few remarks. Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry, sir, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Qasim. I just want to join in your words of welcome to this very illustrious and accomplished panel of professionals. And we look forward to having useful discussion. I can recognize each one of them one by one, but I think I would rather like to spare more time for them to speak so that we can learn from what they have to say. So back to you, Qasim.
Thank you, Joseph. Now we will start our panel discussion. And before we start, I would like to make an announcement that we will have 2 rounds of questions. In round 1, each panelist would be given 5 minutes to respond. And the first question is for Mr. James Acton, and it's related to US nuclear policy under Biden. And the question is that, can President Biden be expected to review arms control initiatives and exercise restraints in his nuclear weapons policy? Over to you, Mr. James Acton.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Director, and it's an honor to be here today and to see both old colleagues who I've worked with before and also to meet some new colleagues as well. So, the first thing to say is I think that, the Biden administration has made it clear that domestic policy is going to be the priority for the time being. With 500,000 Americans dead from COVID, the president and his senior team's time and energy is going to have to be on domestic issues. At the same time, I think there is a recognition of the importance of nuclear issues. We've already seen that with the extension of New START, which was, the first important step that the administration took. That had to be done almost immediately. If it hadn't been extended immediately, the treaty would have expired and then there would have been no possibility for an extension. And so I took that to be, a very positive sign of the new administration's interest in arms control. It wasn't a surprise, but it was good to see it done and to be done relatively quickly and painlessly. I think the next issue, more challenging, that the Biden administration is going to confront on arms control is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA with Iran. Then candidate Biden, before he was elected, made it clear that if Iran came back into compliance, the US would come back into compliance. That policy has been repeated since Biden became president. At the same time, the administration has also emphasized the challenges of coming back into compliance, saying, it's a long way off, trying to play, almost seeming to play down the prospects of getting back into the JCPOA with Iran. How can one explain this? Well, I think the JCPOA is a bit different from New START extension. With New START extension, there was really nothing to be negotiated. Nothing could be negotiated other than the time of the extension that both sides agreed should be 5 years. You couldn't change the treaty text under New START, so it could be done very, very quickly. With the JCPOA, there's going to have to be a negotiation. Even though where both sides can only end up, the original JCPOA without changes. The two sides are going to have to negotiate really the sequencing for how you get back into this deal. When does Iran come back into compliance with the nuclear part? When does the US lift sanctions? And so I think I could be wrong about this, but I would not interpret the current posturing we're seeing as showing a lack of interest in the US of getting back into the JCPOA. I think this is about generating negotiating leverage. And we're already seeing a negotiation in public. The US announces that it's going to reduce the restrictions on the Iranian ambassador in the UN. Iran agrees to somewhat enhanced IEA safeguards. They'd announced that they were going to withdraw from the additional safeguards under the JCPOA, but they didn't do that the whole way. They've just negotiated some kind of deal with the Director General. Iran initially said the US has to get back into compliance first. The US initially said Iran has to get back into compliance first. Now, both sides are kind of acknowledging that a simultaneous process is possible. So even before in-person or Zoom negotiations have started, whatever it's going to be, we're already seeing public negotiations. And so I'm actually quite optimistic about the JCPOA. Then the new administration is going to have to do a nuclear posture review. the Biden, as a candidate, Joe Biden supported sole purpose as a declaratory policy, that the sole purpose of US nuclear weapons would be deterring a nuclear attack. That is going to encounter a fair amount of opposition, both within the US and in particular from US allies. So my guess is that, and this is just a guess, is that the Biden administration is not going to end up with sole purpose as its declaratory policy. I think it will probably go back to something that looks a lot like the Obama formulation, that the US reserves nuclear weapons only for extreme threats to vital interests, but it aims to get into a position where it can declare sole purpose. That is my guess about where the US is going to end up on this issue. But this process hasn't even started yet. And then finally, looking further afield to the future of arms control, the Trump administration, as you know, tried to do this trilateral initiative to engage the US, Russia, and China simultaneously in three-way negotiations. We've already had hints from the Biden administration that it's not going to do that. It's going to seek to engage Russia along one bilateral track and China along one separate bilateral track, and not to try to mix the two, which I think is likely to be a somewhat more productive way forward. So kind of that's where I see the immediate issues on the immediate thinking on the most urgent items on the agenda. Let me put it that way. About both arms control and nuclear restraint. And so I very much look forward to having further conversation about this.
Thank you, Mr. James. You have rightly pointed out that we are optimistic about the JCPOA, and obviously every state develop their own policies according to their threat perception. Now we will move to the question number 2. The second question is related to the extension of New START and its impact on arms control and disarmament regime. This question is for Dr. Peter Topkinov, that how is the extension of New START important for arms control and disarmament regime? Dr. Peter, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for this question, for inviting me to this conversation. There are assessments of the New START treaty extension at the beginning of something bigger, and it was said by the US administration and by the US NATO allies about the New START extension. However, for me, the New START extension, it's not the end, it's not the beginning, it's the continuation of the broader and comprehensive dialogue between Russia and the United States, and potentially with the third countries, about controlling nuclear weapons and about dealing with new challenges to nuclear arms control. And so from this point of view, the New START and the New START treaty extension kept the agenda between Russia and the United States in the tradition built in the time of the Cold War. And of course, now the time is for adapting this tradition to the new realities related to new technologies, new countries possessing nuclear weapons, and to new challenges related to non-nuclear and even non-conventional capabilities, for instance, to cyber capabilities. So from this point of view, the biggest value of the New START treaty extension is that it led Russia and the United States to have a relatively short period of time of 5 years to continue this conversation and to make it broader. Broader, I mean, to include more items into this conversation and potentially to include more countries into this conversation. So, but before starting this conversation, probably the most important thing is just to restore and to manage the damage that appeared in the dialogue between Russia and the United States during the previous administration and even before. So from this point of view, I would list a number of issues under the managing the damage operation between Russia and the United States. The first is just to make existing channels effective between Russia and the United States. Of course, the COVID-19 created additional obstacles, but the New START treaty issue demonstrated that if needed, these countries may deal effectively with these obstacles created by the COVID-19. For instance, even without physical inspections, Russia and the United States last year were able to exchange 1,000 data transfers of data related to transparency and countries building measures of the New START treaty. Second, if possible, to delink unnecessarily political issues from the agenda of nuclear arms control. It was, of course, it's difficult and it's not always possible, but I would like to remind you that in the same time when Russia and United States continue to have a conversation on nuclear arms control, United States and US allies of United States continue to sanction Russia and to sanction concrete figures in Russia, including in the government of Russia, for unrelated issues, unrelated to the nuclear arms control. It's not possible to totally delink this. So, and I understand that it has to be a part of the conversation between Russia and the West, but nevertheless, this is the challenges that the countries should manage before having a comprehensive conversation. And then finally to indicate realistic items for this conversation, because it's not possible to discuss everything in a short period of time. And the last year consultations between the United States and Russia demonstrated that in a short period of time, it's not possible to resolve a huge number of issues, including engaging China and dealing with, for instance, verification measures for the nuclear freeze agreed between Russia and the United States. It's not possible. So I would list the most emerging issues that the countries need to discuss in this short period of time given by the New START extension. The first one is how to deal with the medium and short range missiles, and particularly with the cruise missiles. And even more particular, it's about deployments of these capabilities in the European part of Russia and the European part of the NATO alliance. The second issue is about tactical nuclear weapons. And even broader, it's about low-yield nuclear capabilities with different types of delivery system, including the long-range delivery systems. Then to make a broader conversation based on the previous attempts to deal with the BMD, ballistic missile defense, to make it broader to include airspace defense and early warning capabilities deployed in outer space. And finally, how the cyber, artificial intelligence, and new technologies impact strategic stability. And last but not least, the question about doctrinal issues, because the last year demonstrated that even regarding the public documents, the countries were unclear about what the concrete line in these documents mean. So from this point of view, the doctrinal dialogue is a must-have between Russia and the United States, and not only, and here I would like to say that probably this is the first point where China and other nuclear weapon states should be engaged in the multilateral efforts, because it would be more comfortable and already happened in the framework of the P5. And to summarize the issue, last year demonstrated that it's not possible in a short period of time to deal with all these issues, but it also demonstrated a number of fruitful ideas that can be used during this 5-year extension of the New START. including to work on a framework agreement between Russia and United States and possibly with third countries, to work on the nuclear freeze and to decide how it may be possible between Russia and the United States and possibly with other nuclear weapon states. And finally, how to engage the third countries to the doctrinal conversation and a broader nuclear arms control. So from this point of view, the New START extension just let us prepare for the world after this 5-year period of time with a broad number of issues and challenges that we have on the table right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. You have rightly pointed out that with the changing realities, we have to change our attitude and have to look forward for future cooperation with more transparency. Ladies and gentlemen, now we will move to our third panelist. The third question is for Mr. Zhu Chongyang about emerging new nuclear arms race, a Chinese perspective. And the question is that, would a new arms race continue unabated or would it be scaled back? Mr. Zhou, you have the floor. Kindly unmute, sir.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. Yes, the question is about a new arms race will continue. I think the question, the answer, broadly speaking, the answer is no. People, or hopefully no. People think that Biden is a person who loves arms control, or rather arms race. But of course, there are complexities that may remain. But broadly speaking, the arms race that have started since the Trump administration, in my opinion, will shrink during the Biden's administration. There are several points, I think. The first one concerns the intermediate missile problem. The INF Treaty was agreed when the United States and the Soviet were facing nuclear missile confrontations, and the treaty ended as conventional missiles proliferated among several countries, and the Trump administration dealt with the problem by withdrawal and develop new missiles, and which somehow triggered a new arms race among fellow countries to develop more missiles and related technologies. Biden has stressed that he will keep the leadership in that area, but he will not. He faces difficulties in returning to the original INF treaty. Because the situation, as I said, have changed, and it is not beneficial for the United States to return to the original treaty. But Biden is a guy of arms control, and he is likely to resume some multilateral talks on the intermediate missile problems and seek new arms control mechanisms, such that to keep the United States leadership and also keep regional stabilities. So the arms race problem can hopefully be eased. But in this regard, Biden also faces complexities. It is ideally that many opinion shared among Chinese experts that future dialogue on the intermediate missile issue, sea and air-based missiles should also be included, but that seems not to be the case, not to be the opinion shared by United States experts. That is one main complication. Another point because it's related to the North Korea issue. The North Korea has developed its nuclear and missile capabilities in recent years, and in response, America has deployed its missile defense capabilities around, and its Trump administration has been deploying such capabilities, which has made maybe China and Russia government nervous because they think the missile defense thing would undermine their corresponding capabilities. So it is this point of view is, I think, is shared also by the United States think tanks and experts. So in a recent Carnegie report I read, they proposed the idea that the defense against North Korea nuclear and missile capability should be coupled with China and Russia. Defense capabilities should be deployed in mainland US or something. So if Biden administration could implement that strategy and keep that in mind, it will also, in this respect, ease a new arms race. Another related idea is regarding to the new technologies and the weapons issue. New technologies like cyber attack and AIs and whatsoever has been hot topic in recent years and will of course be important aspects for Biden's policy makings. Past years has been characterized by more competition and more arms race, but less control. But Trump administration has already started to address that problem by proposing a next generation arms control initiative. Biden also has stated to the necessity to keep the leadership of the United States in those areas, but people guess he will probably start dialogues and work towards new regulations and new arms control mechanisms, because setting new regulations are important, because if you make the rules, you have the advantages. So this is why people are rushed to do the thing. For the arms control, the question is if and how the new technologies should be or should not be coupled with nuclear weapons. As James has just mentioned that Biden has stressed his sole purpose nuclear doctrine, which will decouple nuclear weapon from such as cyber attack or other things, but that is not finalized. So we will see. But ideally, new mechanism and regulations regarding these new technologies should satisfy its purpose the people created, and at the same time reduce nuclear war risks and reduce the role of nuclear weapons. That's my answer. So I talked to 3 points. One is about intermediate missile. The other is North Korea and anti-ballistic missile, and the third is new technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zhu. It's quite right that with today's changing reality, emerging technologies are playing a major and important role. And for that, we have to renegotiate and we have to discuss next generation of arms control. Now we'll move to our fourth question, and this question is related to emerging technologies, as you have said, and the need for arms control and disarmament regulation. This question is for Mr. Osman Iqbal Jadoon, that how can emerging technology like artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles, cyber threats, and space-based military capabilities be regulated through arms control and disarmament arrangements? Mr. Usman Jadun, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Qasim Saab. Before I start, just a little disclaimer. I'm speaking here in my personal capacity, and my views may not necessarily reflect the official policy or the government's positions. The specific question that you posed related to emerging technologies and the need for arms control and disarmament regulations, the short answer, of course, there is indeed a dire need to move in that direction, to bring all these new technologies emerging.
Mr. Usman Jadun? I believe we have lost contact with him. Yeah, he's back again. Please
Yeah,
go
I'm
ahead, sir.
sorry, I lost you for a minute.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So before I move to the specific question that you posed, I also wanted to briefly share my thoughts on what are the current trends in the multilateral arms control arena, and especially with the new US administration now in power and this expectation that there would perhaps be a sort of revival. So not that a new nuclear posture review is out or some major policy speech was made, but from the selected statements by senior officials and what recently Secretary of State Blinken said in the conference on disarmament, we can discern 4 clear focus areas. The first one is bilateral with the strategic peer competitors. This is the bilateral arms control with Russia and China. We all know and other panelists have dwelt upon them, what are the parameters there. And then there's also this other bilateral engagement, which is not with strategic peer competitors, but with what the US sees as irritants or perhaps threats to its interests abroad. Here I refer to Iran and DPRK, again, different toolbox available for both. The third major focus area that I could discern relates to the multilateral arms control arena. Here, the one non-proliferation treaty, NPT, and the second is what can be done in the UN disarmament machinery. Within the NPT, as an outside observer, I have a very bleak view of whether it can deliver or be able to achieve any major success. But more specifically on the UN disarmament machinery, I have not heard any proposal, even from academic circles, where new technologies, emerging technologies, are being proposed to be brought into the realm of discussions, or what to talk of treaty negotiations. And then there's this fourth focus area, which is not on legally binding instruments, but on codes of conduct for quote unquote responsible behavior, be it responsible behavior in outer space or responsible behavior in cyberspace, but so far nothing in the field of artificial intelligence. So so far, at least I can't foresee any major bold or new initiative specifically which covers new technologies. It's only natural. History teaches us no great power would willingly give up its strategic advantage. It would only come to the negotiating table when it either sees its major strategic rivals matching its capabilities, or reducing risk becomes imperative, or some smaller rivals threaten dominance, or there is an risk of the proliferation risk is unduly high. Only then, I think, we will move towards multilateral arms control. We also need to understand that in the arms control arena, the requirement of all major possessors or major technology holders, it's very important to have an inclusive approach. We can end up with treaties like the TPNW or Landmine Convention or cluster munitions, which have limited membership, which do not necessarily encompass all the possessors, and then their efficacy obviously always remains a challenge or a question mark. So in this case, we do not see, I personally do not see any major technology holder or major power even contemplating development of regulations or prohibitions on new technologies. But the need is obviously there. So some of these emerging technologies are perhaps more advanced than others, or have evolved into more tangible weaponized forms, for instance, space and cyber. And then there's others like AI-enabled, artificial intelligence-enabled autonomous weapons, and there are other applications in command and control, etc., which are still being developed. And then there's delivery systems like hypersonic glide vehicles, etc. So on their own, today, they do not make the traditional nuclear weapons, let's say, redundant. But if any one of these weapon systems, this new exotic weapons, reaches the stage where it can offer the same level of deterrence or strategic dominance which nuclear weapons provide, perhaps we can see a move towards some sort of multilateral arms control. But this is not on the horizon for the time being. Why is there a need to stay ahead of the curve? Arms control, multilateral arms control traditionally has always fallen behind. Weapons have always been developed first, and then we have moved to control their development. Because the risks and uncertainty is much higher today than it was perhaps in the 60s or 70s. These new exotic weapons will also enhance reliance on nuclear weapons by those who perhaps would feel that they are falling behind in this new arms race. And it will be very difficult to put the burden of non-proliferation on developing countries or those who join the race late. And it's very difficult now to create a treaty or a legal regime neatly divided into haves and have-nots. So there is obviously a very dire need to start now rather than later. Final few parting thoughts on implications for Pakistan. You see, Pakistan lately has not been perceives itself as not being treated fairly. And the approach towards South Asia has not been even-handed. The playing field has been tilted in India's favor. So if with these new technologies, through a free unfettered access of these new technologies or their provision to what we see as our rival India, would obviously be a major development for Pakistan, especially if it somehow degrades our nuclear deterrence or our national defense capability. It would seriously affect Pakistan's strategic calculus. So because we continue to face technology denials while in our eastern neighborhood, technology development or transfer is being facilitated. This would be a major issue for Pakistan. For many years, I used to act as Pakistan's delegate in the negotiations on lethal autonomous weapon systems. They have been going on since 2013. And frankly, they are moving at a very, very slow pace. And the negotiation is not about developing a regime for regulations or prohibitions, but in fact, it is about whether we even need regulations or prohibitions. Do these weapons actually make the battlefield or make the international humanitarian laws applicability easier or more difficult? And so if you strictly speak about multilateral arms control arena, Conference on Disarmament, First Committee, other conventions, etc., there is very, very little scope or prospect for any major breakthrough. So I don't see that within the arms control arena, the multilateral fora, and I also don't see the major powers or those who generally take the lead in proposing any such thing coming out. I can elaborate more perhaps during the question and answers or the discussion session, if anyone wants. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Yudhunsa, for highlighting the need to work on this arms control regime for emerging technologies. Now we'll move to the final panelist, and the question is for Dr. Adil Sultan, that what are the implications of US nuclear policies for South Asia? Dr. Adil Sultan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Qasim Saab, for making me part of this wonderful panel. Being last speaker, it is very easy to say that I agree with all the speakers, whatever they said. That's in short. But I think what Osman covered, he gave a round of overview of implications South Asia also, and I agree to that. But first of all, let me start by why we discuss this whenever there is change in leadership in the United States. So there are expectations by the international community that probably there is going to be significant change. But objectively speaking, the US arms control approach has been consistent globally and also towards this region also. There were some apprehensions that probably apprehensions or there were concerns about Trump's handling of arms control policy, especially about North Korea, JCPOA, and New START. But otherwise, if you see on NPT, United States is going to maintain the same position. On CTBT, there's not going to be any change. On Treaty on Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons, US is not going to ratify that. So in sum, if we say US approach overall towards arms control is going to be consistent, what it was previously. Obama also came up with, President Obama came up with a vision of a nuclear weapon-free world, but he was realistic enough by saying that not in our lifetimes. So probably we may hear the same thing from Biden also. Not much is going to happen. Towards South Asia now, coming to this, there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States policy circle that India's military and political stature needs to be enhanced to as a China containment policy, and even the think tanks that they support. But I believe this is a fallacy. India is never going to stand up against China, but the momentum, the way India has built this argument, and the Democrats and the Republicans all support this logic, and that's how this is directly affecting South Asia. And we have seen the US support India's candidature for United Nations Security Council permanent membership, what United States did with India on the export control regime and the arms control issues, trying to bring India inside the mainstream non-proliferation regime by creating exemptions or coercing the NSG members to grant India exceptions from the export control guidelines. And the way this campaign was launched to bring India in, to make India a permanent member of the NSG. So that has been an approach consistent since Obama, Trump era, and even under Biden. I think this is going to be the same. Now, India has built its case well, that it can stand up against China if held by the external powers. And that's how United States and India, that strategic partners, that they come towards the recent agreements in which United States and India, they will share satellite imageries, information, which will help India about its situational awareness once talking about or employing its military against Pakistan. That's a major concern for Pakistan. That happened in under Trump era, but this is going to continue because towards South Asia and because the Indo-Pacific strategy has primacy in US policy circles, so they will continue, they are likely to continue with this approach towards India. Now, Pakistan has long been stating, yes, India has its own right, United States has the own right to choose its partners and things, but what we are trying to communicate to the United States and the rest of the international community, that it should not be at the expense of Pakistan's security interests. But I think we cannot expect that any major change will happen in the future. I'll briefly talk about the emerging technologies. This was, some of my colleagues spoke about these technologies in a larger context, but more specifically, once we talk about regional perspective, let's say talking about the hypersonic weapons. These are issues, the hypersonic ASAT, S-400s, and all these developments which is happening in South Asia. And some of these are being assisted by external powers. So the trend lines, as we see in South Asia, it continues. These are likely to continue, or these are likely to affect adversely on South Asian strategic stability. Another important point is that as US-China rivalry intensifies because of their own geopolitical interests, Pakistan may have to face the brunt of this rivalry. There could be pressures on Pakistan for whatever happens between United States and China, and Pakistan could be used as a lever to pressurize Pakistan to get certain concessions or a large geopolitical interests. Finally, I think there were talks about, there are expectations from Biden about whether he will make some significant change in the arms control issues or not. But just a thought that as President Obama came up with his vision of nuclear security summit by bringing all the parties or major stakeholders at one platform at the leadership level to bring that understanding, common understanding, to raise that awareness on nuclear security issues. Probably Biden could also emulate the same thing, and he could initiate take such initiative where he can host that kind of summit level meetings at the leadership level to develop that common political understanding, so that some of the political issues, not the technical issues, can be debated and some of the differences could be addressed. Probably that is one way of giving a jump start to the arms control debate at the global level. So I'll stop here, and I'll be more than happy to respond to the questions if there are any.
Thank you, Adil sir, for very interesting comments on the subject. Ladies and gentlemen, with this we have completed our first round of questions from the panelists. Now we will move towards the second round of the questions. And since we are also receiving questions from the participants, so we have also arranged a interactive discussion session after the second round. So we'll put this question to these panelists at that stage. So the second round is basically meant for a quick response, and it is requested from each panelist to give a very short and precise comment on these issues. Earlier in first round, we have heard about the Chinese perspective on the arms race. Now I would request our Russian and American expert that what is their perspective on this emerging new nuclear arms race. Mr. James, would you like to go first?
Sure, thank you. I don't think there is an emerging arms race an emerging nuclear arms race between the US and China. I think there is certainly a non-nuclear arms race, a very vigorous non-nuclear competition between the US and China. And I think it's in both countries' interests to try to restrain that competition. The situation with nukes is a bit different. I mean, the US intelligence community has assessed that China has low 200s of nuclear weapons, and that it only has enough fissile material on hand at the moment to roughly double that number of nuclear weapons. So, you know, in a world in which China could produce maybe 500 nuclear weapons, and the US has 4,000 nuclear weapons, I don't think we're in a nuclear arms race as such. I do think, though, that one can see ways in which competition in the nuclear space can filter down into competition in the conventional space. So, for example, you know, China is clearly concerned about US developments in things like ballistic missile defense. That potentially makes China invest more heavily in ways of penetrating those defenses, including doing things like building more dual-use missiles, which, because they're dual-use, then exacerbate US concerns about the conventional balance. So, you know, I do think there is a real competition going on here, and I think that competition is dangerous. But at least for the time being, I don't think we're going to see, you know, we're not going to see what the Trump administration officials stated was going to happen, of China trying to build up its nuclear arsenal in an attempt to reach parity with the US. Those dynamics, I think, have not yet emerged. Perhaps they could emerge in the future. Maybe China will start fissile material production, restart fissile material production. I can't exclude that possibility. But this kind of like traditional arms race of who can build the most nuclear weapons, that's not what we're seeing at the moment. I would just say, if I can put one question on the floor for anybody who wants to maybe talk about when they have a chance. But, you know, as I say, there is some kind of strategic competition between the US and China, even if it's not a traditional arms race. And I'm just wondering what spillover effects, if any, people would imagine seeing in South Asia.
Thank you, Mr. James. Now we'll request Dr. Peter to respond on this question.
Thank you so much. I think that James correctly highlighted the term competition. And even more, it's not necessarily the competition. I would add my opinion, probably wrong, but I hope that not. It's not the competition of capabilities, it's a competition of technologies in terms of how the sides develop, how they see what they need and how they develop the technologies in terms of to serve their strategic goals. And from this point of view, it's even more dangerous if to compare with a traditional arms race, where the idea was to match the balance of other side with numbers and types of capabilities, specifically nuclear weapons. Here, in terms of dealing, for instance, with a nuclear threat, another side may develop conventional long range capabilities and add to that also advanced defensive capabilities. So it's difficult to have a substantive dialogue between the sides involved in this technological competition, because they don't have a lot of points of mutual understanding. So they are not on the same page in terms of what they want to develop and how they want to respond to the challenge, to the strategic challenge from the other side. So from this point of view, I would say that it's not the arms race, it's a technological competition, but it doesn't make it less dangerous in terms of strategic stability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peter. As Mr. James have asked a question, so taking an opportunity and of the presence of our Pakistani experts, so I put this question to Mr. Adil and Mr. Usman Jadoon, that how they view that this strategic competition between US and China have some spillover effects on South Asia. So, Mr. Adil Sultan, would you like to respond to this question?
Yeah, sure. James, as I briefly alluded to in my comments also, that the brunt of China-United States competition, probably Pakistan will have to face that consequence because of its close partnership with China. And what we have seen in the past few years, this is what India is doing. It is selling this case that it needs to be helped to build its capability to stand up against China. And that fits in well with the US Indo-Pacific strategy. And whatever India is developing in terms of military or nuclear capability, there are no questions being asked by the United States and other major powers also. So they are enhancing their conventional capabilities, their nuclear capabilities. They are going to space by testing ASAT. And nobody is asking that question. The point over here is that whatever India is building, it is not likely to use against China, because China is a much bigger country and much bigger potential. But the way this case has been built and the way India is being helped in its military potential, this is likely to be used against Pakistan in a future crisis. So that is our primary concern, that whatever happens at the global level, we are not party to it directly, but the way India is being propped, it is going to directly affect Pakistan's security interests, and that's the cause of worry also.
Thank you, Dr. Adil Sultan. Mr. Usman Jadoon, would you like to respond to this question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much.
The question was about the spillover effect of US-China competition on South Asia.
Yes, sure. I would certainly. Thank you very much. See, Pakistan does not pose any threat to the United States or to United States interests or to the United States allies. Pakistan has a sort of a quote unquote sole purpose for its own nuclear deterrence also, which is to deter all sorts of aggression from India. And India has a much larger conventional military capability. And we think it also harbors those aggressive designs and those hegemonic policies, which can threaten Pakistan, and therefore the need for this capability by Pakistan. So with the growing rivalry between US and China, if the US starts seeing Pakistan's nuclear weapons capability as somehow a threat to United States interests, this strategic paradigm could change. Not because of Pakistan's view changing, but because of US lens towards this region changing. If the US also starts believing, this is now another factor which could change their calculus, that Pakistan's capabilities somehow threaten India, which is emerging as one of its major ally. And in that sense, it wants to tighten the screws or twist arms. The approach towards Pakistan could also change. But in my view, this is how the US-China rivalry or strategic competition could have a spillover effect in South Asia. But as far as Pakistan is concerned, it does not want to get embroiled in this big power competition because it is not in that league. It is not in our security interest. It's not the purpose of our whatever capability we try to maintain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jidun Sab. Mr. Zhou, would you like to respond to this question?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not expert on South Asia problem, but I think about the problem from another angle. As I mentioned, the Biden administration has huge space for devising new arms control and regulation mechanisms, and those regarding such as new technologies and emerging technologies and weaponizations and so forth. So the challenge, another kind of challenge will come from the arms control side of the new mechanism. And for South Asia, it is hopeful that countries such as India and Pakistan can participate in those new dialogues and gradually move on to more formal mechanism and such as treaties or other kind of mechanisms. And from the bright side, that will bring ease of tensions to the area and reduce arms race risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hu. Ladies and gentlemen, for the second round, I still have quite many questions, but since our senior experts are also present and they have joined this event, so we'll stop this second round here and we'll start an interactive discussion session because they are also asking a relevant and more potent question about this issue. So one by one, I'll give them floor for their comments and for suggestion. So initially, I'll give the floor to Mr. Tariq Rauf. He has a question from Mr. James Actor. Mr. Tariq Rauf, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. James, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the Biden administration's views on the Open Skies Treaty, from which, as you know, the Trump administration withdrew last year, as well as on the future of the Trump administration's CEND, or Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament Initiative. And finally, very briefly, your views on Secretary Perry's call for eliminating ICBMs, the land-based ICBMs. As you know, the US is talking about renewing the ground-based strategic deterrent. And very quickly for Director General Usman Jadoon, the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan gave an expansive presentation at the high-level segment at the Conference on Disarmament earlier this week, in which he covered several different areas. And I was wondering whether Pakistan is thinking about putting forward any ideas or initiatives on confidence-building measures with regard to space weapons or cyber weapons or prevention of an arms race in outer space. Thank you.
Mr. James, you have the floor.
Sure, thanks for the question, Tariq. So, I think the Biden administration has not yet announced a policy on either open skies or CEND. That's their issues that are going to have to be reviewed. That said, look, I think CEND, creating the environment for nuclear disarmament, is kind of a no-brainer. Like, I think it's a good idea. I would be very surprised if the Biden administration stopped doing it. But it has to make this decision. Like, I'm just guessing here. Open skies, I think, is a somewhat harder issue. There is a debate in the US about whether the US withdrawal from open skies was legal, in the sense it complied with US law. This is not a debate about international law. This is a debate about whether the Trump administration complied with US law in the way it withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty. And I think that if, Joe Biden, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, would have certainly taken, I'm guessing, would have taken the view that the US withdrawal was illegal, and may even have been making the argument that it was possible for the US to re-enter open skies without going through Senate ratification. I'd be interested whether Joe Biden as president reaches that same conclusion. Presidents have traditionally been quite keen to preserve the power of the office. And so I think this is actually I genuinely don't know where the US is going to come out on open skies. I think it could go either way. I also just think from an international perspective, it's very hard for the US to re-enter a treaty where the other states have accepted that US withdrawal was legitimate. I think that creates international problems as well. So, I'm not, as much as I support open skies, and I think this administration supports open skies in principle, unfortunately, I think it's unlikely we will see a return to open skies by the US. On ICBMs, all I'd say very briefly is I'd encourage you to read a report that my colleagues, George Perkovich and Pranay Vadi, put out just the other day with our model nuclear posture review. Their proposal for how to deal with ICBMs, which I strongly support, is to life extend Minuteman III, not to build a new ICBM, but to life extend the existing one, while trying to negotiate reductions in the ICBM force with Russia. I think that is a much more politically palatable way forward than just simply pulling ICBM forces up out of the ground. But I think it avoids the huge costs of trying to build a whole new generation of ICBMs.
Mr. Usman Jadoon.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Tariq, for the questions. Good to see you. Very quickly on the two specific questions that you posed. First on PAROS, prevention of an arms race in outer space. Quite frankly, Tariq, Pakistan is on the receiving end here. We are not a major player in outer space. We don't, as of now, have a satellite launch capability. We do not have a large number of satellites. We don't even have plans of the type that many other major spacefaring nations do. We have our ambitious plans, but I think they are for a more distant future. We are at the receiving end here. The debate in outer space has already moved from militarization to weaponization. It is already militarized. What we are trying to, as Pakistan, as developing countries, is prevent its weaponization. So what shapes our view specifically in the South Asian context is A, India's anti-satellite capability, which it demonstrated through a debris generating test in March 2019. And B, also the possibility of India integrating anti-ballistic missile systems, the two systems that it is developing indigenously in its space-based arrays or assets. And perhaps in the future also deploying actual weapons in outer space, not just interceptors or supporting infrastructure, but even weapons, rods from God which can target targets on Earth on Pakistani territory. In terms of initiatives in the Conference on Disarmament, we have always been a very strong supporter of the treaty that was jointly put forward by China and Russia, which is primarily on the prevention of placement of weapons in outer space, but also bans use of force against outer space objects from Earth. We are a strong supporter. But bilaterally, back in the days when we used to have a CBM dialogue with India, which the last round was held in 2013, Pakistan used to propose to India initially a bilateral arrangement on non-militarization of outer space and subsequently a bilateral arrangement on non-weaponization of outer space. But India did not accept any of these proposals. You also asked me about fissile material treaty. It is indeed been on the international agenda for a number of years now, perhaps almost 3 decades. And the major powers see it as a low-hanging fruit because it is completely cost-free for them. And I think its time has passed, its appeal has passed, and its utility has passed. It was never about constraining the capability of, let's say, the P5 to develop nuclear weapons. It was always about the new entrants. It was always about India, Pakistan. But the time that has been afforded to them, these 30 years when the treaty languished in the hallowed chambers of Conference on Disarmament, that logic has also perhaps no longer valid. India was given preferential treatments, waivers, and a big boost to its fissile material production capability. It already had a big number of stocks, but it managed to increase them exponentially. And Pakistan also got a lot of time and also built up its fissile material needs. So today, this treaty doesn't make sense. It will not halt a qualitative or a quantitative development of nuclear weapons. And Tariq, I know for a fact that you have made this case also in your own writings and talks in different places that the original intent or logic behind this treaty is perhaps not entirely valid today. So flogging a dead horse, I don't think would make much sense. It can be a feel-good treaty. We can argue that it would perhaps stop some theoretical capability of Iran or constrain DPRK. But other than that, today it has very limited utility. It did have a lot of utility in the 90s or even in the 2000s, but not in 2021. So that would be my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Jitendra sir. Major General C sir, would you like to make some comment on the US policy under Biden?
Right, thank you very much. And I'm indeed very educated by the remarks of various panelists. One area where maybe a little more discussion is needed is that how the application of the US government law like CATSA is going to be seen in the context of India seeking S-400 missiles from Russia. And what would then be the implications of if that happens or does not happen on the relations of India with Russia as well as USA?
Thank you, sir. We have also been joined by Zohar Abdisab. Zohar Abdisab, would you like to make a comment?
Awesome. In fact, I feel that in my view, and my experience for the last about 17, 18 years in this field, including 5 years in UN 1540 committee, non-proliferation and the strategic export controls or the strategic trade management is all political. So it's nothing technical. It's all political decision-making or political will of the leading and major powers. So therefore, if India tries to, or if India is getting S-400 from Russia, and whereas the Americans have a law, anybody doing with Russia will be sanctioned, like the Turkey has faced the problem. If the Americans want the Indians to be there in their bag, they will do something. Because I remember once in Argonne Laboratories, I met Dr. Ted Perry, and I asked the question about the Indo-US deal. And I asked that the US laws or the international regime does not allow. So he said that it's a political decision making. We will find a way out. So we'll find a way out to help the Indians on the strategic capability building, because it is important for them to build India as a counter to China. But on another hand, I feel that the historical evidence with regard to India developing a capability to stand against anybody is very poor. India kept having the new submarine on lease from Russia for 30 years, and only then they could develop their own nuclear submarine, which again met so many accidents so far. So I don't think that the Indians will be, it is my personal opinion, Indians will be able to develop any kind of military capability to challenge China and serve the purpose of US in South Asia or Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuhar Abdisab. We have a question from the participants. That is from Ittefaq Khurshid. And that is question for James Acton, that, sir, how do you see President Biden's approach toward the emerging technologies, especially in relation to hypersonic weapons? As we have seen during President Trump tenure, the US was very actively engaged in developing of HGVs, and couple of tests were conducted. Mr. James, would you like to respond to this question?
Sure, I appreciate the question. So I think that when people think about hypersonics in the US, people immediately think about the conventional prompt global strike program of 15 or 20 years ago, the aim of developing hypersonic weapons with global ranges. That's no longer the focus of US efforts. All of the systems that the US has been developing in recent years are much shorter regional systems, ranges of a few thousand kilometers, say. The numbers are classified. I don't know exactly what they are, but conventionally armed non-nuclear systems with that kind of range. And to the extent that that has a rationale and is not being driven by technology, it is primarily about China. And I don't think that's going to change under the Biden administration. I mean, the individual programs will be canceled. I mean, there's like 5 different hypersonic programs going on at the moment. No one has ever, the US has never had an intention of bringing all 5 of them to fruition, but the idea is you start with lots and you see which ones are most effective. And I would be quite surprised if the US didn't deploy some intermediate range hypersonic capabilities within the next 5 years. I do think the other aspect of this is an interest in arms control. China and Russia are both pursuing their own hypersonic systems. Both are interested in regional systems like the US that are dual use, that could be conventional or nuclear. Russia is interested in, has already deployed Avangard, a very long-range hypersonic system that's nuclear only. There is some suggestion that China is working on a similar kind of very long-range nuclear-only system to penetrate US defenses. Avangard is accountable under New START. It counts towards the ICBM limits on New START. And one of the things that I've advocated for a future US-Russia arms control treaty is that all intercontinental range gliders should be accountable under the treaty, whether or not they're nuclear or conventionally armed. So Russia would benefit from that because it would place a limit on American conventional capabilities that Russia finds worrying, even if the US is not pursuing them at the moment. And the US would benefit from continuing to cap Russian ultra long range hypersonic nuclear systems like Avangard or any future systems. You know, whether the Biden administration will pursue that kind of arms control, I don't yet know. I mean, as with lots of things, all of this is going to have to be reviewed, and a policy is going to have to be developed. This is more the kind of policy that personally I would support, but I could plausibly see the Biden administration pursuing.
Thank you, Mr. James. There's another question for you. That what will be the most complicated nuclear challenge for the new administration? What is the trickiest problem to solve?
So was that for me?
Yeah, that was for that's for you.
I think I would probably flag North Korea there, actually, which we've barely discussed so far. I think it's tricky from a number of perspectives. I think the Kim the Kim regime is pretty intent on developing intercontinental range nuclear weapons. It probably has them already. It wants to be able to hold the United States at risk. I don't think this is a bargaining chip anymore, if it ever was one. I think this is about developing capabilities to deter and conceivably coerce the US. It's a country where, I certainly wouldn't suggest that North Korea wants to be isolated, but it worries a lot less about isolation than, say, Iran does. And I think that a realistic policy to North Korea will require a very painful reassessment by the US. US policy towards North Korea for a long time has been complete denuclearization. For 5 years now, I have not believed that's a viable policy, that we ought to be able to focus more on risk reduction with North Korea, capping the degree of the threat to both the US and allies. And you're starting to see that debate in the US. There are people who used to be very strong on denuclearization who are acknowledging that, it's no longer feasible. For an administration, though, to give up on the goal of denuclearization would be a painful thing for an administration to do. And I'd simply say that I think the situation with North Korea that looks quite stable right now could get very bad very quickly. Kim Jong-un, in his address a couple of months ago, pretty much said that he was planning to test. It wasn't a unconditional announcement of resuming testing, but I think we could see North Korea resume very long-range missile testing, conceivably even nuclear testing in the near future. And so kind of this crisis, which is quite quiet right now, I think really could pick up very, very quickly. So I think there's lots of tough challenges, but this is probably, I think, the toughest one.
Thank you. I would like to place this question across the panel, that what is the biggest challenge for this present Biden administration when it comes to arms control and nuclear issue? And I will ask all the panelists one by one, starting from Mr. Adil Sultan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had also raised a hand. I wanted to comment on this thing. I think while North Korea is being seen as a potential major challenge, but Iran could also pose a similar kind of a challenge. And reason why, Biden administration, even Biden before coming to power, had shown interest in reviving JCPOA, and the Iranians, they know it. So what if they raise the stake and they negotiate from a position, or start negotiating from position of strength, because they know Biden administration wants to revive this JCPOA. And what terms? So if the conditions are tougher, would it be easier for Biden administration to get consensus from the Congress or get support from the US, especially keeping in view the United States is more divided now than before. So that could become a major challenge that Biden wants to, but he may not be able to do that. And if he is not able to do that, what happens to Iran or JCPOA, and whether they want to build more or not. So that's my brief comment. But subsequently, if you have time, I would also like to brief on what Jan Nasir said. So maybe later.
Okay. Dr. Peter?
Thank you so much. I think that among the biggest challenges for the US administration is how to adapt the nuclear modernization process in the United States to the challenges existing in from a bunch of countries, including Russia, China, and North Korea. And so from this point of view, the question is about from the previous administrations, the current administration received already budgeted programs and already designed plans about how the nuclear arsenal, the nuclear capability of the United States should look like in next few decades. And the question is about somehow catching up with already almost completed the process of modernization of nuclear arsenal in Russia, and also with a quite ambitious process in China about building and developing nuclear arsenal. It's not necessarily about adding new warheads, but it's about adding new capabilities. So from this point of view, it's a challenge. And this challenge for the Biden administration, of course, will be reflected in the nuclear arms control efforts by this administration and tracks that this administration may have with Russia, with China, and beyond this triangle as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peter. Mr. Zhou, you have the floor to answer.
Thank you. My thinking is Biden also perhaps has another very big problem. Biden has returned recently the Paris Agreement to combat climate control that shows that he is a person that loves to solve global problems. And there is a global problem in arms control as non-proliferation that is since the situation gone bad in recent years, and other more than 100 countries have made a treaty on treaty on banning the nuclear weapon in effect at the beginning of this year. So this signifies that the NPT-based traditional non-proliferation regime is starting to fall apart, and the whole world regarding the non-proliferation is maybe going to divide someday. I don't know if that is a problem at all to Biden administration, but if that is a problem, that requires more aggressive steps for the administration. US has to make much more concessions to make in nuclear disarmament. That is my thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zhou. Mr. Osman Jadun, would you like to respond to this question?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. Off the top of my head, I personally think that perhaps the biggest challenge for the new US administration would be in terms of China. So with the Soviet Union and later with Russia, there were a number of bilateral arrangements which included CBMs, risk reduction measures, arms control, even limited disarmament. But with China, bringing China into the fold perhaps would emerge as one of its biggest challenge. So like James said, this is not a new arms race, or this is not a nuclear arms race. This is a new type of arms race. In this arms race, technological edge is given more premium over numbers, and this is a somewhat of a different paradigm, and the Cold War context cannot apply here. So Trump administration tried a trilateral approach with China, using sort of inviting them into its talks with Russia, and that failed because the asymmetry and differential is very high. So the trilateral approach failed. The bilateral approach is also very difficult because of the very disproportionate numbers. But and then the multilateral, bringing everyone in, has its own complications, again because of the differential, but also because that is not even desired by the major powers. So this is perhaps going to emerge as a challenge, because there is increasingly going to be pressure on the administration from the public, from think tankers, from Congress perhaps, to do something about China's military rise. But then can it make an offer that China can't refuse? Thank you.
Thank you, Jidon sir. General Disab, so you raised the hand, sir. You want to make some comment or question? Unmute. Kindly unmute yourself.
Right. This was with regard to the Biden administration and its approach to the extended deterrence, and especially in the context of Europe, where Russia has again been identified by US, Europe as the resurging threat. Similarly, the extended deterrence in the context of Japan and South Korea, where if tomorrow North Korea also gets very assertive.
Thank you, sir.
So if our American colleague could answer to this, please.
Okay. Mr. James, would you like to respond to this question?
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part of that about North Korea. Could you just explain the question again?
Yeah, the last part was that once we talk of the extended deterrence, in the past, Japan and South Korea have also been quite uncomfortable with regard to the credibility of extended deterrence in the face of resurging, in the face of an aggressive North Korea and the US trying to assuage the concerns.
So it's a really important issue. I think the Biden administration, President Biden himself has said he feels that President Trump didn't treat US allies very well over the past 4 years or so. And, it was brewing below the surface, I think, was a lot of concern from US allies, both in Europe and in Northeast Asia. And I think this concern was fundamentally about a lack of political trust that the US would come to their defense, rather than concern about US capabilities. I'm not saying there was no concern about capabilities, but I think the concern was much more focused on a lack of trust. And, one had a lot of statements by President Trump, or things he didn't say, like, when he visited NATO and failed to re-articulate Article 5, which is NATO's collective defense commitment, or his failure, or his very aggressive negotiating stance with South Korea on the cost-sharing arrangement for US troops there. So, I think what we're going to see is a Biden administration that is very keen to strengthen relations with allies, to emphasize the US commitment to them. And I think this is going to have an effect on nuclear policy. As I mentioned earlier, as vice president, even shortly before he left office, Biden came out and supported sole purpose at a speech at Carnegie. I think privately there is going to be a lot of concern from allies, both in Europe and in Asia, about sole purpose. And that's one of the reasons why I suspect, just guessing here, but that the US ultimately won't adopt sole purpose.
Thank you, Mr. James. I believe more and more questions are being directed towards you. There's another question that, do you think that managing proliferation risk from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, will be more difficult than confronting proliferation threats from so-called rogue states?
You know, I do think that in terms of immediate proliferation crises, Iran and North Korea are particularly acute threats. And, you know, in answer, Adil raised the question about the challenges of getting back to the JCPOA. I mean, I think one of the reasons why, incidentally, the Biden administration is not just saying, let's restart it immediately, is precisely because they, you know, if the US appears too desperate to re-enter the JCPOA, then Iran might start raising the price on Iranian entry into the JCPOA. So, you know, I think part of the reason why the Biden administration is standoffish is precisely to try to avoid the Iranians raising the price on re-entry into the JCPOA. I mean, look, with Saudi and Turkey, I strongly suspect Saudi has ambitions in that direction, but it's not violating any kind of agreement at the moment. You know, whatever ambitions Turkey may or may not have, and you know, I don't claim any expertise in either Saudi Arabia or Turkey. Again, this is not an urgent proliferation crisis. You know, right now Turkey is abiding by the terms of all its safeguards agreements with the IAEAs. So, you know, I think as a general rule, keeping states that are not actively pursuing illegal nuclear weapons programs right now from doing so is a much easier challenge than rolling back those programs that exist. And in particular, you know, if you do succeed in reinstating the JCPOA, in kind of keeping Iran away from the nuclear threshold, you make it much less likely then that Saudi is going to go in that same direction.
Thank you, Mr. James. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the debate is becoming more interesting, but we have to stick to our time. So we will now go for the second last question. And I invite Dr. Tariq Rauf for this question. Tariq Rauf, sir, your floor.
Thank you very much. So I have a question for Air Commodore Adil Sultan, who's at the Air University now. So there is some talk about the US increasing its military-to-military cooperation with India, and also potentially providing or building even advanced aircraft in India, such as the F-16 or similar aircraft. And if Pakistan has to maintain its qualitative edge in the air over India, how can Pakistan, in a sense, convey to the Biden administration that were it to lose this QE in the air, Pakistan would have no alternative but to invest even more in ground and sea launched ballistic and cruise missiles, which would have larger implications for the region as a whole? Thank you.
Dr. Adil Sultan.
Thank you, Tariq, for this question. US-India military cooperation is not increasing. It is already much beyond what we were expecting or what we were warning to the rest of the international community, and also asking United States about the implications of ongoing. So I think it would be unrealistic to expect that Pakistan asking United States to impede or slow down its military cooperation with India, because it impacts adversely on Pakistan's security interests. We had been doing for the last many years. And we know that US is not going to do that because of their fixation on Indo-Pacific strategy. Notwithstanding that, I think the February 2019 episode of the Balakot crisis, I think that also underscores the point that quantitative superiority by India doesn't matter. So what it matters is how you employ your capabilities, whether these are limited in numbers, what kind of weapon systems are. At present, there was a perception, yes, Pakistan had conventional disadvantage once it comes to the Air Force, but once after 2019, I think there is a pretty good confidence in Pakistan about its nuclear capability. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to do anything, of course. So, but we have to be realistic, and that's what Pakistan is looking now, relying more on China for its aircraft, further the next generation of aircraft that they are probably going to build with Chinese. But for now, I think at the Air Force level, there is pretty good balance, and Pakistan is pretty much confident, especially after the Balakot incident of 2019. Qasim Saab, if you allow, I just wanted to make a few comments, or maybe I'll come later about some of the issues that I requested if you have time. But it's up to you.
Maybe you can share a shorter version because we have to close now.
Okay. So there was talk about what would be the biggest challenge for US. So that was in terms of nuclear. But if we are looking at overall, I think the biggest challenge for US would be to reestablish its leadership credential, because the image of United States was damaged by the way Trump followed the policies, especially on the arms control issues. And at the recent Munich Security Conference, also President Biden also asserted this point that the United States will work to reestablish its leadership credential. Why it is important is US has always been in the lead for all the major arms control initiatives, especially the NPT, the ongoing debate. And the forthcoming NPT review conference depends a lot on how United States will deal with the non-nuclear weapon states within the NPT. So that's one important. And this is also relevant to something what General Nasir said, because if United States wants to reestablish its leadership credential, it has to give some semblance of principled or rule-based non-proliferation regime. It cannot have two different standards, that sanctioning Turkey for buying S-400s and allowing India to continue buying from the Russians. So that is one important issue that I think that will be a test for Biden administration also. James had repeatedly talked about, and I agree, that this new arms race or the evolving competition, the military competition, as we would say, it's not nuclear specific. There are several other disruptive technologies that will affect the terrorist relationship between states. And James had very articulate, had been very strongly advocating about this nuclear entanglement concept. So I think that is also one which also affects South Asia, because what we are seeing in South Asia, that what the technologies that India is building, the ASAT capability, the hypersonic weapons. So if you, I'll not go into detail because it's, we are not talking tactics, but these technologies, once acquired, operationalized by India, it could very well affect South Asian deterrence relationship. Now, these are not essentially nuclear capabilities, the hypersonic weapons or things like that, but we have to look, if we are looking at the future, I think we have to see a wholesome picture, not only the nuclear arms control, but whatever the arrangements are, they should be looking at how other technologies affect the terrorist relationship between states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adar. If any of the other panelists want to share any final thought or final comment? Mr. James, Mr. Jadoon, would you like to make some final comments, or should we close this session?
I'm good. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to acknowledge Dr. Peter's presence because he has to leave early to pick his kids. And now it's time for the final question. And this question is asked to Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, Chairman, Board of Governors of Institute of Strategic Studies. That's in the light of this debate, of this panel discussion, how you view US nuclear policy under Biden. And after this response, you can also make some concluding remarks about today's discussion, sir. Khalid Saab, you have the floor.
See, I feel really very diffident to speak after the experts around the world have spoken on this very important subject. I'm not expert in this field, but my feeling is that President Biden has indicated that his approach to all these questions would be different from that adopted by President Trump. And already, this renewal or extension of START 1 and also intention to return to JCPOA. All these are good auguries, you know. Seeing these all efforts at arms control or disarmament, as was pointed out in the debate here, they are being pursued at bilateral level, regional level, international level. And I think all these avenues are important because, for example, between US and Russia, of the 1,346 nuclear arsenal, 91% is with US and Russia. So if they enter into negotiations, try to regulate this field, I think it is important. And similarly, now new powers emerging, China, and new threats, from nuclear proliferation. So US, China negotiations to find some code of conduct, is also important. But I would just like to make one observation generally, Now, whatever arrangements are made bilaterally, regionally, and internationally, for their credibility, it is important that they are applied in a non-discriminatory manner. Because if these rules, regulations, codes of conduct, if they are applied selectively, then they lose their credibility and also their efficacy. Now, for example, we have this patent case of how Pakistan and India is treated. There are rules, regulations, but then exemptions are made in favor of India. And similar treatment is not meted out to Pakistan. So this erodes the credibility of or effectiveness of these various regimes. We are hopeful that President Biden, who is a known internationalist, and also is, I think, generally wants to pursue this non-proliferation or arms control, that he will see to it that the existing as well as the future rules, regulations, codes of conduct in the armament field, they are applied without any discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Al. Ladies and gentlemen, with this we come to an end to this panel discussion. I once again thank you all the panelists one by one, especially Dr. James M. Acton and Dr. Peter Topchkunov, Mr. Zhong Chongyang, Mr. Usman Kwalajadoon, and Dr. Adil Sultan, and special thanks to Dr. Tariq Rauf, Major Nasir Ahmad, and other participants who have joined for this panel discussion. And reports and all other related recordings and everything about this event is available on ICSI's official website. With this, once again, I thank you all and wish you best of luck to all the participants and panelists. Once again,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Allah Hafiz.
Thank you.